Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I'm Carolyn Clinton, the president of the Norwich Historical Society. And the mission of the Historical Society is to foster a sense of place, and our Discover Norwich programs have been designed to do just that. We began Discover Norwich during COVID, and it was a way to connect us with our neighbors and our community. And we have continued it. It is one of our most popular programs. While the programs cover a wide range of topics, from tonight's talk on researching the history of your house and property, to last week's discussion of behind the scenes at the Norwich Inn, they all reflect history, and history informs them all. As you may have heard, the Norwich Historical Society suffered a break-in and vandalism right before the new year. The intruder was a teen in a mental health crisis, and we're responding to the event in several ways. The donations for Discover Norwich are dedicated to increasing the security of our collections and our building. And we will be sending 20% of all the donations to the Youth and Family Services Division of the Healthcare and Rehabilitation Services, which serve Windsor County. Tonight, we, as Sarah mentioned, tonight we're bringing you our fifth and final Discover Norwich program for 2023. And we hope you've enjoyed the program so far, that you've been able to see, and that you'll offer us any feedback or ideas for future programs. We're putting a link in the chat, Sarah, is that right?
It's there.
So that people can provide feedback. In tonight's program, Sarah Rooker, our director, and Alan Berolsheimer, a longtime affiliate of the Historical Society, past president of the Society, and a partner with Sarah in teaching history to teachers. They are going to walk us through how to research the history of our homes and property, and I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to end the Discover Norwich program with this particular program. I think it is one that people love history and they love their homes, and this is a way to really connect to your home and to your place by doing this kind of work. So we're excited to do it. And before we really dig in, I also just want to say thanks to all of those who have made a donation to Discover Norwich. It's making a difference. It's making a difference in the lives of our youth, and it's making a difference for us as we continue to really, recover from the incident we had this past winter. So thank you all for that. So tonight we have a program called Finding the Stories Where You Live, and I'm going to share my screen and launch our slideshow. And I want to make sure that everyone can see it. Carolyn, can you give me a thumbs up that everything looks good? Yes. Wonderful. All right. So I'm going to launch us off tonight with maybe one of the very first sources I might use if I were going to be looking for the story of my home. And I've researched both two houses that I've lived in and created books for my family. And my family's always loved to go through them and look at the maps and look at the photos and think about who lived in the houses and think about if the walls could talk, what would they say? What stories would they share? And so we're not only going to just walk you back through each owner back and back and back, but we're going to try to flesh out some of their stories for you and really show you how we did it. The other thing we're going to do is try to highlight what sources you would use and where you can find them. And so Ellen and I are taking turns, and when I'm off, which will be in a little bit, I will put into the chat a handout which has links to a lot of the resources that we're going to be sharing with you tonight. And while this is Norwich focused, it's also Vermont focused. So if you're from outside of Norwich, many of the resources that you're going to hear about tonight will also be available for you. If you're from New Hampshire, we've added comparable links onto the handout for you so you can look at comparable maps. And I'll try to remember as we go along to talk about some of the differences between Vermont and New Hampshire as we go, because I know that we have folks from across the river. So I think the first spot that I would start when I am looking at how to research my home is to the National Register of Historic Places. And Norwich happens to have quite a number of historic districts thanks to the Historic Preservation Commission. So Brigham Hill, the Village, Goodrich Four Corners, Jericho, there's a mid-century modern district, and there are individual homes and a detailed barn survey. They're all on the Historic Preservation page on our website. And when you get into them, the authors of these National Register nominations have written extensive histories about the houses, and it's has a lot of architectural stylistic information, as well as whatever deed work they've been able to do. And you can find these National Register nominations for the whole country. And I'll provide the link for you for that. So it's possible to get them for many, many other towns. So I would start there, because you never know. If you live in one of these areas, you got your house history almost done. Another source that I would point you to would be some specific books. James Garvin's book, which is The Building History of Northern New England, is a wonderful book that looks at the evolution of building technologies. It looks at the evolution of heating, of foundations, how to date the nails in your house, how to date your building from all sorts of interior and exterior details. And he talks a lot about how the houses were built. The Field Guide to American Houses was maybe one of the first books that I started using. It has lots of line drawings to help you identify the architectural style of your house. And it includes not just a drawing like you see on the outside, but also all the little details that come together to give a house its style, its windows and its doors. And I'll show you a few images of that in a minute. The Big House, Little House, Back House Barn book, which is a favorite of mine. When I very first got out of college, I worked with Tom Hudka on this book. And he does a wonderful job of talking about the connected farm buildings of New England and how these barns all work together. And it kind of helps you visualize, especially if you live in one of these old farms that connect back to a barn, you can walk through and start to understand how all the spaces functioned. The Field Guide to New England Barns and Farm Buildings is also incredibly helpful for dating your barns and understanding what all the outbuildings are that you might have. So the National Register and books are great ways to start. Looking at your own house is a great way to start. And these images actually come from the Field Guide to American Houses. So when you're looking at your house and thinking about its age and what aspects of the house to kind of think through, you can look at the doors, or you can look at the windows. Here are 17th century windows. Here's the shape of windows from the 18th to early 19th century. And then as glass, it became easier to get glass. You start to see bigger panes as you move through the mid-19th century to the present. Doors also can tell you an awful lot about houses, and in the field guide, all these doors are connected to various dates. And it's not just the door though, it's the crown molding around the door, the casing around the door, the shape, the type of windows there are, the panels, all these pieces come together to create an architectural style and give your house its architectural character. Over here, we've got even the newel posts can tell you something about the date of your house. On the left, you have 1750, and then you have 1800. When you start to get the federal style, this more delicate linear style to a home with those delicate fan lights and finials. And then this one is 1830 and then 1850 as they become a little bit more curvy and more robust. So all these little details come together. Here are three styles that we commonly see in our Northern New England homes. Capes with center chimneys. They're usually 1.5 stories. Sometimes around the doors, you can see Greek Revival details, which tell you that they're maybe the 1830s and 40s instead of earlier. This one, which has these, might be from that time. The federal style here, you see these very delicate fan lights and these little curves going across the top of the side lights and this Palladian window. This is the federal style from the 1780s to 1840. And then you start to get the Greek Revival style, which is a little more robust, bigger proportions, more geometry. Sometimes up the side of a cape even, you get these fluted pilasters and these big wide entablatures going across the top of the building. So looking at your house and looking at the style can give you lots of hints to when your house was built. Here are two capes. The one on the top left is around 1800. It has a granite foundation. You can see it has a center entrance. The chimneys are on each side, so it has a center hallway. It has 5 lights. Oops, sorry. I have a very persnickety mouse. It has 5 transom lights going across the door right here. And you'll notice that the roof line is kind of snuggled up to the windows. So it's a lower ceiling to keep for more efficient heating. Down here in this cape, you're starting to see a little more space, bigger, higher ceilings. Maybe they had wood stoves instead of fireplaces. You see around the doors side lights. You see pilasters. You see this wide board going around across the top. And this house is more like 1840. And you start to see a lot of these slightly bigger capes in the 1830s and 40s in Norwich because it's the time of the sheep boom. It's a population boom here in this community, and lots of houses start to be built in the 1820s and 30s. So if you have a house like that, you can maybe think that it might be part of this big sheep boom time. All right, Alan, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about maps for a couple of minutes. And in fact, it was a map that really led to my interest in researching the history of the house that I live in the first place. Some of you may be aware of the Beers map from 1869, which we'll be looking at shortly. And Sarah and I use the Beers map quite a bit in the work we do with teachers. It's a really great historical resource and a really great teaching resource. So I'd spent a lot of time looking at the Beers map of Norwich. And of course, on that map is identified, maybe not all, but many, many households by name. So I kind of knew more or less whose house I was living in. Who owned that house in 1869. And that's kind of what launched this inquiry in the first place. Go to the next slide, Sarah. But we're going to go back in time from closer to the present and work back through a series of historical maps. So it's important to note that there are like the Beers map, there are similar maps from the mid to late 20th century that also show the roads some of the streams and of particular relevance here, households along all of these parts of town. And the Historical Society has scanned all of these maps, 1940, 59, 69, and 73, and you can look at them on the NHS website. So that's a really great resource. If you want to know the mid and late 20th century history of ownership of houses in town. The next slide is the colored slide, the colored image that we have of the Beers map, which comes out of this series of county level atlases, an atlas that was done for each county. Well, the volumes are by county, and each county has a map for every town in Vermont. And many of them have insets as well that show you a zoomed in view of usually the village center of the town, or perhaps an industrial district. So as I say, the Beers map is, there's the inset of Norwich Village from the Beers map. And I encourage everybody to spend time looking at this map. It's just fascinating, gives you an incredible window into what the town was like at that moment in time. You can see shops, you'll see names that you might recognize, and you really get a view into who was in town and what was happening in town at that moment.
I'll also add that on the Beers Atlas map, which you can look at from Historic Map Works, and the PDF, which we put in the chat, has a link right to it. When you get to whatever town you're looking at the bottom, there's a link to Google Earth Basics. And when you click on that, it'll layer the Beers map onto Google Earth. And there's a transparency slider, so you can actually find your house right on the Beers map. So it's kind of fun to do, and it's at Historic Map Works.
So a few years earlier, 1856 to be precise, this guy named Hosea Doughton produced a series of maps of Vermont as well. And so here's the image of Norwich and the 1856 Doughton map. So again, we're moving back a little bit in time and seeing how the town was developing.
If you're having trouble clicking on links in the PDF, I can email out this PDF to you again tomorrow if it's not working.
And in the chat, Sarah just noted that if you're in New Hampshire, the maps that are comparable by time to the Doughton map is called Walling. They're the Walling maps. Also, I believe from 1856. So here's another inset. This is from the Doughton map. So again, it would be interesting to do a detailed comparison of the 1856 inset and the 1869 inset and see what has changed over that course of that 13 years. One thing you might see, just since it's coming to mind, I didn't actually notice it on the Beers inset, but many of you will know that Norwich University barracks burned in 1866. So I see Norwich University on the Doughton inset. By 1869, the school was gone.
It's called the Norwich Seminary instead of the Norwich University.
Now we move all the way back to 1810. James Whitelaw, who was the early surveyor general of Vermont, produced maps in 1796 and 1810. This is the 1810 version of Norwich. And these maps generally highlighted just a few prominent buildings, like churches, for example, churches and meeting houses. It showed the basic roads and rivers and things like mines and bridges.
I would also point out, and you can look at this, is that all of these little circles here are mills.
Oh,
And
mills.
so-
I forgot. I meant to say mills. Yes.
Yeah, so this one
Absolutely.
here is, this is a sawmill, and there's a sawmill here, and a sawmill, and then these are ferry crossings down here, because there are no bridges yet. And here's the meeting house at the center, which was today sort of the location of Union Village Road and Maple Hill Road.
Sarah, I'm not seeing your cursor
Oh,
move
you're
on.
not?
No,
Okay,
are other
so
people
no.
seeing the cursor or not?
All right.
Yes. No, I can see it.
Oh,
Okay,
okay. Must be just
thank
me.
you. Thank you.
No, we don't.
Yeah,
Okay,
I could see it too.
okay,
We don't see it's too small.
all right,
Right.
thank you.
It's bright red.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
So the maps that we have that precede the Whitelaw maps are called lotting maps. And these were drawn up by the proprietors of every town in Vermont. The proprietors were the people, mostly men, almost always men, who were given the charters, who were granted charters by the governor to develop and settle towns. And you can see this is it's interesting, the lotting maps are all available on the Secretary of State's website. So this is the lotting map for Norwich. And again, it's interesting for just historical perspective. These are the names of the original people who purchased these lots. And one thing that's interesting to note is that you'll see all those slivers of lots along the river, and then the larger rectangular lots inland. The reason for this is that the water lots, the river lots, were much in demand, the most valuable lots in town. And if you were a proprietor, when the lands were divided up, you usually got a river lot as well as an inland lot. We'll be taking a closer look at one piece of this map at the end of the presentation.
So those are the maps. And another wonderful resource in Norwich are the historic listers records. And thanks to Linda Cook, who's here tonight, for saving these. But we have these for every piece of property in Norwich from and they run from the 1946 to the late 1950s, early 1960s. And they're quite interesting to look at. They've got the name of the owner, they have the location, in this case it's Church Street. It shows that they're renting a room, but there's only one bath in the house. It shows that they have septic, that they are heating the house with coal. It tells you how many bathrooms. Sometimes it'll tell you, in this case, there's a woodshed and a 2-car garage, and it gives you the value. Here is a close-up of the picture of the house. So there's a snapshot for many of these. And here's another one. You might recognize this brick house that's up on Beaver Meadow Road, then called Mechanic Street, the Aldrich House. And this one shows also the deed records. And so sometimes you can go to these and start to get a jump on your deed research by looking at the listers records. In this case, there was a 4-room apartment upstairs. It was heated by steam and oil. There were 6 rooms downstairs with a toilet and 7 rooms with a bath. It also showed that it had a large old barn. So there's a lot of information that's really quite interesting on these, and we'll look at one of these again in a bit. We are in the middle of scanning all of them, and we will eventually have them all online, but you can also come in and look. They can be a little challenging because the names of the streets have changed in some case, so you do have to kind of really hunt for them. These listers records, I got an email asking if they're available for New Hampshire also. These are our town records. But I think, most towns had listers and they had to do their tax assessment, and basically that's what that is. And so you can go to your town office and look at the tax records and start to get this information. So yes. Okay, so those are some of the sort of general big sources: your house itself, books, maps, your town lister records. Now we're going to walk you through the Best Buy in Norwich. Alan, I'll let you introduce this.
Okay, so this is the house I live in, otherwise known as 729 Union Village Road. It's right up on the ridge, the top of the hill before you head down into Goodrich Four Corners. And this was the ad that appeared in the Valley News when the house was for sale. It was purchased by my wife, Nancy Cressman, and her parents, Howard and Caroline, in 1984. And I want to just preface walking through what we've learned about the house by making a couple of points. One is, for the sake of posterity, since we're all historians and we want to help out future historians, it's really good to keep good records about your house in the time that you are the custodian of it. So about 10 years after she bought the house, Nancy was doing some renovations, and she wanted to be able to, she's always kept very careful records of all the work that she's done on the house. But when she started these renovations, she thought, I know this is an old house. I know it's historic. I wonder if the Norwich Historical Society has any information about it. So she went to NHS. Lo and behold, there was a folder of material about the house. So that, of course, is a great place to start if you want to research the history of your house. Go to the local historical society, see what information they might have. When Nancy bought the house in 1984, there was a barn across the road. The barn actually was taken down and moved within that first year. I think actually within the first few months. It was taken down by Matt Brown, whose name you might you might recognize. Matt is a fine artist. He makes woodblock prints. He's got a studio up in Lyme. And Matt lives in Lyme, and he took the barn down and rebuilt it on his place to be his at-home studio. So the barn was repurposed to very good use. So when Sarah and I decided to do the research to figure out the history of our house, I had in a folder that Nancy kept the deed of her purchase of the house. Again, a really important record that you want to keep. The house was bought from the Finers, Chad and Susan, who I'm sure most of you know. And the deed actually refers to a land record book that is kept in the town clerk's office. So this is a really important piece of knowledge that you need to know if you're going to be doing this research, is that you can trace the chain of ownership through these land records. And if you have the deed to your house, it will point you in the right direction for that first reference. So in this case, the deed tells us to go look at book 71 and gives us the page numbers. There's also a card catalog in the clerk's office. This is actually, this is what they use. Actually, no, I guess it's the index that they use. So the catalog goes along with the actual land record volumes. So we cross-checked it in the card catalog. And again, it tells us to go to book 71 and those pages 423 to 424. So we did that. There I am holding that book. So this is where the transaction, when the Finers bought the house, is recorded. And it says that the Finers bought the house from the Gilmans. I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about the Gilmans. I didn't know who'd owned the house before the Finers did. And sure enough, this record tells us to go back to book 55 to find the previous transaction. So that's what we did.
I think
A
one
little
thing that's really important when you're doing this is to make sure you remember what a grantor is and a grantee is. And I actually have to have that written down. I don't know why I can't keep track of it.
I always forget to.
I have to have a little index card pinned practically to my shirt to remind myself of who these people are as I do this.
So we went back to book 55, pulled it off the shelf again. And this slide summarizes the chain that we traced in these land record books from the Gilman's purchase of the house, not the Gilman's purchase, but the next transaction was in 1961. The house was in effect purchased by Eunice Gilman. And this takes us back all the way to 1903 in a series of 3 transactions. The first couple of transactions make it clear that the house was in the Gilman family, and Lee Gilman, who we'll learn about in a minute, was the executor of his father William's estate. And there seems to have been some kind of an intermediary, a person named Urban Waterman, who's again a well-known name in Norwich, and that facilitated the passage of the house from William Gilman's estate to his wife Eunice Gilman. That's in 1961. But going back one step further, we find that a woman named Eliza Gilman Burroughs bought the house from people named Minnie and Merton Bruce in 1903. Now, we learned from the previous record that Eliza Gilman Burroughs was the mother of William Gilman. So we know that the house stayed in the Gilman family from 1903 up until the point when the Finers bought it in 1977. So we decided to do a little bit of census research. That's another really valuable tool that you can use to find out the stories about the people that lived in your house over time.
But before we do the census, I'm going to jump in for 1 second and just say that one of the things that was really critical for us as we were doing it was to make sure we got the information down that's highlighted there. We needed to know the grantor, the grantee. We needed that description of the land and boundaries. We needed the dates and the next book in the chain. And writing all that down, especially the description of the land and boundaries, is really important. Because when you lose the trail and you have to then try to figure out if the next deed you're looking at is the right one, that description of land and boundaries can really make a big difference. And you don't want to have to go back again. So getting all this information down is really critical. So don't forget to copy down the boundaries.
Yes. And we did lose the trail after this. Eliza Burroughs, after she bought the house in 1903, that record did not tell us where else to go in the land records to trace the previous transaction. But I was going to say, I did a little census research on Eliza Burroughs and turned up the outlines of a really interesting story, and eventually was able to corroborate that William was in fact her son. But he was born in San Francisco in 1861. And there was no record of his father that I was able to ascertain from the census. So that was a bit of a mystery, which was subsequently filled in for me, but not until we'd actually prepared this presentation.
Couple of quick things. Someone just asked if can't you just take a picture of the record at the town clerk's office? Often you cannot. They often don't want you to photocopy. They don't want you to take a photo, or they might want you to pay even for taking a photo. So the rules are it's pretty restricted, and each town clerk can be different. So you really do need to talk to them ahead of time and have clarity around what is allowed and what isn't.
Right.
So here's the lister's
Again, just
record for the house.
emphasizes the importance of writing down
Yeah,
the information that's in the land record.
yeah. Here's the Lister's
So-
record, just to have,
Here's the Lister record, right, which we actually did not have when we first prepared this presentation. And down in the lower left-hand corner, there again is the record of a transaction in the land record. We haven't actually looked at this. I suspect all it does is clarify something about urban watermen being some kind of a legal pass-through when the estate of Eliza Burroughs, when the estate of William Gilman was settled and the house was passed on to his wife Eunice.
I did find it pretty interesting though, that in the 1860s, I mean, the 1960s, sorry, the house was still being heated by stoves, as you see in this.
Yep. And I learned subsequently that it was heated by coal stoves, at least in the 1940s and 50s.
Okay,
Next up is, this is a close-up of those two photos that are on the Lister record. That front yard looks, the facade of the house is essentially the same. We've put on a little addition, but the front yard where that garden is now a driveway. And there's a fence up that separates the driveway from the yard. And of course, that barn is gone, although the foundation is still there.
so here we've gone back a little bit further. Was this at the Historical Society or at your house, Alan? I can't remember.
Well, I believe Nancy got this photograph from the Historical Society. Some of you may think this is a familiar photo. And the reason is that it just so happens to be what's on the front cover of the Book of Norwich Historical Photographs that Margaret Cheney McNally and Fran Niles published some years ago. It's an Arcadia book, Images of America. And just by chance, it's our house that's on the front. This photograph was taken circa 1910. And here's the Gilman family. That's William Gilman with the horse, his wife, Millie, and their three kids, Lee, Clyde, and Ruth.
I think, one thing is that if you have those names on your deed, you can then go to your local historical society and start looking for those people. So you may, when you're doing your house history in an historical society, they may not have a folder for, what's your address again?
729 Union Village
Yeah,
Road.
729 Village Road. But there will be, we have a folder for the Gilman family. So getting those names, and it's just one other way to sort of start to get an entryway into photos of your house and the people who once lived there.
So we also knew that just down the road from the house was the Root District Schoolhouse. And so while we were stymied at having lost the trail in the land records, we did some lateral research. We knew that there would be a folder about the schoolhouse at the Historical Society. There's material, what about maybe half a dozen or 10 or maybe a dozen schoolhouses at NHS?
At least.
At least, maybe even more. At one time, there were as many as, was it up to 22, I think, 22 different school districts in town. So this is a picture of the Root District Schoolhouse. This is the original schoolhouse. I'm sorry, not the original, but it's the one that was it's not the building that's at the just beyond the corner of Goodrich Four Corners Road and Union Village Road now. I believe this is the building that was over on Goodrich Four Corners Road. You can probably confirm that for me, Courtney, right?
But
I
here,
think the other, actually, I think the other one is the one that was on Goodrich Four Corners Road.
Yeah, I do too.
This one has the entrance there with the porch, and all the other pictures going forward until it burned has that porch.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
one
So
of
we
the,
I really studied them a lot, and that boy right there on the lower right-hand corner is Sid Cook.
yes, and standing next to him is a Gilman girl.
Okay. Well, one of the Gilmans taught school at the Root Schoolhouse. Are you coming to that, Alan?
No, I don't think I actually knew that, but if we go to
think
the
it
next
was-
slide,
Yeah,
the
go
kids
ahead.
are identified. And there is Elaine Gilman. And she is standing next to Sydney Cook. And Elaine Gilman was William Gilman's granddaughter. She was the child of Clyde and his wife Wilma, and she was actually adopted. Now, again, this is something I learned by a fortuitous circumstance when a descendant of the Gilman family who lives in the Upper Valley called us up and asked if they could come visit the house.
Mhm.
And we had a really wonderful conversation, and she gave us she gave us scans of a bunch of family photos, and also helped fill in some of the gaps in the story of the Gilman family that we had not been able to figure out simply by looking at the census.
One of the things that you can use is if you use the Beers Atlas map, which is color coded by school district, and you know where your house was, you can figure out what schoolhouse the children who lived in your house would have attended. And then you can go to your historical society and look up the schoolhouse and then see if there are class photos and see if any of the names show up. So again, it's one thing to just like trace the deeds back, but to add the color and the stories and to think about the children who lived in your home and what their daily lives were like, it really helps to connect to the schools as well.
So here's where our trail ended at Eliza Cook Gilman Burroughs. As I say, I did some census research that revealed a few things about her, but left a lot of gaps as well. This photograph, in fact, came from the woman I mentioned who contacted us about coming to visit her ancestral family's house.
But we were frustrated and stuck. And so here's the reminder that we were stuck right here with Eliza Gilman Burroughs, and it didn't say what book to go to. And it was so frustrating. And so what we had to do by this point, we were getting back, it's 1903, there's no longer card catalog indexes. So we had to go to the index books. And there are 3, I think, index books going back through time. And here's one. I wish I'd taken a better photo of it, but I didn't. But you can see on the left, it says number 13. So it's book 13, and then it lists all the B's, and then what page number it's on. And so we started going through it, looking for Bruce, which we knew was the next name, to try to find that deed. So we were back to the index again.
And lo and behold, we did find the transaction where Minnie Bruce bought the house. She bought it from Inez and John Goodrich, who were actually from Waltham, Massachusetts. This is kind of turned into another dead end, but what was most important about this is the description of the boundaries. So this property that we're talking about, where my house is, was bounded on the north by Charles Johnson's land.
Here, I'm
That
gonna put
makes
the
sense
map.
because I know that the neighbor just to our north, when Nancy bought the house, was Cutting Johnson. Easterly by the highway past the Samuel Phelps farm to Norwich Village, south by Johnson's land, and westerly to the Bradley farm. So that is very important information. And with it, we went back to the 1869 Beers map. Again, a little bit earlier than the date of this transaction, which is 1880, but close enough that there's a reasonable assurance that this area on the map that we identify is actually where we are. So I had, as I say, first been intrigued about what my house was by looking at the Beers map, and F. Pratt is the name that I had identified based on where the house is as the probable owner of the house at this time in 1869.
So
There, I
those
didn't
boundaries on the deed did it.
I didn't let you animate the boundaries. You want to do that again?
I did it while you were talking.
Oh, you did? Okay. I didn't see it.
So
So
then,
there, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say, so then, we wanted to think more about who was Mary Pratt. And so we went to ancestry.com and looked at the census, and we looked up Mary Pratt. And here she is. My chat is covering everything up. I can't see. It's the 1880s.
Wait, hang on just a second there. We didn't know Mary Pratt's name. We looked up Pratt
Pratt.
in Norwich in the 1880 census, and this is what we found.
So what we found is that Mary Pratt, age 76, is boarding with
Charles Johnson,
Johnson,
the guy who lived in the house just north of where we are.
right, and is on that deed, and that she's widowed. So we found out a little bit more about the Pratts. And then the story keeps getting a little more interesting.
Gets very interesting. So we were able to find this record in another land volume that Mary Pratt died intestate, which means she didn't have a will. And then, whoops, sorry. Her estate was administered, and it indicates that she had sold the land to Charles Johnson. So that's her neighbor with whom she's boarding. That was in 1874. So we're going back a little further now. And again, we get another reference to go to book 16, page 131. And there is recorded the transaction wherein Francis and Mary Pratt sold the land and the house to Charles Johnson, provided that he perform all the conditions. And didn't say anything more about that, but it did indicate that there was actually an insert, another page, another document inserted in the book right at that point. And that really tells a very interesting story. We're not going to read all this, but basically what happened was Francis Pratt was elderly and ill. And in order to provide for Mary, they sold the house to their neighbor, Charles Johnson, in exchange for him giving them a life tenancy in the house. In other words, allowing them to stay there until they died. And that he would provide support for them, including keeping the rooms comfortable, providing a horse for their use, and that he would pay money to their children, Joseph Henry and Laura Elizabeth, in the case of their death, if they died within 3 years. So on the one hand, it's interesting that they sold the land to Charles Johnson, but then a few years later, we find that she's a boarder in his house. And it's a little curious as to what that actually means. I've come to think that perhaps it meant not that she was actually living in his house, but that if he owned her house, that maybe that's what the census was recording. Not clear. Anyway, it's an interesting story.
We kept going back. We've lost the deeds at this point, and we're in the census again. And here we are in 1860, so right before the Civil War. And here's Francis, he's 62, and Mary's 58. And here we see that she's deaf. So that adds a little bit more to this need maybe for her to be cared for. And they've got a farm laborer named Justin living there. He's attended school within the past year. He's age 16. This is pretty typical of the time that there would be farm laborers coming and staying on a farm. But 1860 made us think about the Civil War. And again, if we're thinking about what the walls could say, what the walls could tell about people's lives, we wondered what happened in the Civil War. And so we looked up Justin.
Before that, though, we looked at the agricultural census.
Forgot about this.
We again, from previous work we had done together, we knew that there are very detailed agricultural censuses for the state, 1850, 60, 70, and 80. So we thought, all right, let's look for the Francis Pratt farm in Norwich in the 1860 ag census. And sure enough, we found out that he had 70 improved acres, 4 milk cows, a couple oxen, a pig, and he's growing a bunch of crops. And there was an apple orchard. So that again provides us some really interesting information about what this farm was back in 1860.
Yeah, but notice it's you'll notice a difference between the 1860 and the 1850 in a minute into how much he is actually growing and how much land he's using. But back to the Civil War now. Here's Justin, and another resource that is an incredible Vermont resource is the Vermont and the Civil War website. It's a database where you can look up soldiers by name or by town. And so we looked up Justin to see what happened. Well, Justin went into the service in July of 1864, and he by October of 64, he was a prisoner of war, and he died in November in prison.
In Richmond, in the infamous Libby prison in Richmond, Virginia, which is, you know, a notorious place in Civil War history.
So these I just point out that these databases can give you, if you know who's living in your house during the Civil War era, and that Beer's Atlas of 1869 is right after the Civil War, so that's pretty close. You start to get a whole other sense of what your home went through at the time. And in this case, we weren't able to get actual primary sources from Justin. You know, he didn't live very long. The Historical Society, there's lots of letters and photographs of soldiers. And so there might be something at the Historical Society that connects to your home. But here's Libby Prison, where Justin died within a month of getting there.
So then we went to the 1850 agricultural census, and it's much more extensive than the 1860 record. So it's interesting to think that this farm was much more prosperous in 1850 than it was in 1860. He had more animals. He had 7 milk cows compared to 4. He had 8 other cattle. He's raising sheep, 15 sheep. And a lot more, much greater quantities of crops.
More land too.
Yep. Well, he's 10 years younger, right?
I think he probably had the 25 unimproved acres in 1860, but he's got more improved acres in 1850 than he had in 1860.
June Engler has said in this that regimental histories can help see where Justin was at different times and possibly help understand where and how he was captured. Yes, that's true. And that record also showed that his mother received a pension after he died, and the pension records available at the National Archives tell tremendous amounts of history about soldiers. So one could go down a giant Civil War rabbit hole connected to your home for sure. We've gone back 10 years earlier. In 1850 is that magic year when the census provides detailed information about who is living in the home. You get to 1840 and earlier they start to look like this, but we've underlined in red Francis Pratt. And we figured out for you that there's a man and a woman and then 2 children, a boy and a girl under age 14 living in the home. And we know from earlier on that would be Joseph and Laura, who received the money from the house that we saw in the deed. Now, what do you do when Pratt didn't appear in any of the deeds? We completely, you notice we haven't done any deeds. We lost them.
We have failed to find in the records when Francis Pratt bought this land, if he bought, if he built the house, if somebody else built the house and he purchased it after it was built. Haven't figured that out yet.
So what do? You Google it, right? So we Googled Francis Pratt from Norwich. And here we found a genealogy, or no, I guess the history of Windsor County, Vermont, which had a genealogy piece in here about the Pratt family. And it turns out that he came from Massachusetts to Norwich in 1833. And so that's an old deed. So maybe it's lost, you know, maybe it's loose at the Historical Society. We're just now starting to catalog some loose deeds. And he was married, and then his wife died, and his second wife was Mary, who we know so much about now. And he had these two children, Joseph and Laura. And Joseph marries and moves to Pomfret, and Laura marries in town. So there we are. We have more information about when he arrived. For me, then I thought more, my next question, Alan, was when's your house built? And so I went back and looked at the house again, kind of more closely, and thought about what I said earlier about capes. Was this house here before 1833 when he arrived? Or was it here, was it built right around the time he arrived? You know, when I look at it, I think it was built around the time he arrived, you know, at the time of it's the sheep boom when he's coming up to Vermont. And the reason I think that is because it's got that higher, a little bit about that higher ceiling level to it. It's just a little bit bigger than a house, you know, a cape that might have been built in 1800 or 1790s in Norwich. I think they would have been much smaller and much simpler. So I think
You know what else?
House.
You know what else might be another clue is that bay window on the south end.
Mhm.
That probably is not a bay window, wouldn't necessarily predate the 1830s, would it?
No, or that bay window might have been added though. I
That
bet
could have
was
been added
in
later,
the
too.
1880s or 90s.
Yeah.
So you have to go back and look at your house again and just think about what's the architecture saying, you know, and that's what I think it says. I could be wrong, but that's what I think. But we don't have a deed saying when the house was built. So then you have to, you know, go back and look that way.
So we decided just to go back to the lotting map for perhaps some additional corroboration that we were on the right track. And if we go to the next slide, this is the area where the house is, and it's just interesting to note that there's Johnson names amongst these original proprietors, and there are root names amongst the original proprietors. And of course, we know it eventually came to be known as the root district for the school. So not that this is definitive, but it does give us additional evidence that some of these, you know, when we go from the proprietor's map of the 1760s up 100 years further into the future in the 1860s, that there are common threads amongst the names. You can also see the Slafter name, and we know the Slafter house is down at the corner of Goodrich Four Corners and Petrel and Union Village Road.
Of course, we need to acknowledge that the land that we're on is Wabanakik, the land of the Dawn, part of the Abenaki world. And that's really where the story might begin. So I'm going to recap for you and take you back through what we've learned, just to tell the story of the house. And it's really broad brush stroke. But really, after the proprietors, who really were speculators, making land deals and selling the land, we see Francis Pratt arriving from Massachusetts. It's the height of the sheep boom when many homes and farms are establishing themselves. His two children go to the newly built one-room school. The farm is 100 acres with sheep, lots of crops, oxen, sugaring, they're making beer. And as Francis and Mary age, their children leave home and they need to take in a hired man, Justin. He helps, but the farm diminishes as they age, and he leaves for the Civil War and tragically dies quite quickly. In their very elderly years, Francis and Mary live on the first floor of the home, and their neighbor, Charles Johnson, takes care of them. And after they die, he purchases and sells the farm. In 1900, we see another family, the Gilman family, come to live there. William lives there with his mother, Elaine, and his wife and 3 or 4 children, and they also go to the root school. The family lives in the house, passing it down to a 3rd generation, Lee, and it stays in the family until the 1960s, when Todd Feiner buys it, and then Alan and Nancy finally take ownership of this space. So there's our story that we worked you all the way back, and then we brought you forward. So I'll stop my screen share. And we are happy to take questions. I was having a lot of trouble using the chat with my my really delicate cursor, so I'll look at some of these things, these questions. But if you have questions, please raise your hand. I think that'd be easiest because there's so many people that'll pop you to the front. Linda, do you have a question? Linda, while you're getting ready, Jim, do you have a question? Nope.
Are you talking to me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So what was Mary Pratt's maiden name?
Palmer.
Palmer. Could the property have come through the Palmer family? Did you look that direction? I'm sure you probably did.
No, we've not done the comprehensive research, so we haven't investigated the Palmer line to see if there might be some information there.
Yeah, because if you're not finding a purchase by Pratt, maybe it's because it was her family's property.
That's
would
a
have been,
possibility.
Yeah, or the first wife, because he comes with the first wife and she
Right.
dies. So it would have been a different family. That's
Right.
possible. Yeah, they're all coming up from Massachusetts together. Yeah, hard to know. There's so many possibilities. We've gotten a story, but there's always more to learn. Linda, do you have something to say? Okay, well, let us know when you do. Any other questions? You can put them in the chat too. I see Wanda said that on the original lotting maps, there's a lot north of Alan's house that has a handwritten dotted line through it. What would that mean if we see that on the lotting maps?
I'd like to say something about that.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
If you go to the Goodrich Four Corners National Historic Registry nomination that talks about a piece of land that was reserved for a schoolhouse, and that would be right where it was, right across from the Slafters farm.
Mhm.
And I can't remember who owned that piece of land, but it's eventually there was a schoolhouse built there, the second root schoolhouse.
Got it.
There's been 3 root schoolhouses.
Thank you.
Off the top of my head, I don't know what that dotted line might be about.
That's what I think it might be.
Oh, you think that's the school portion?
Yeah, I think it was apportioned off and it looks about the right size. I'm not sure.
Yeah, interesting.
I'd like to go back to the Goodrich Four Corners description, see if it makes sense. And then I wanted to also say that the Cutting Johnson's house was built, it was identical to your house originally, Alan.
Uh-huh.
And I think I was told it was built by the same person. So,
Another puzzle piece.
right.
Any other questions we have for today? It was so fun to have you all do this. I want to have Sherry please put into the chat again a link to a little survey form. It's just asking a couple of fast questions and asking you if there are other topics you'd be interested in for future programming. So Sherry, if you could please do that, I would appreciate it. And Dana, question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I was just wondering, we have a very old home on River Road, and I had tried to research it quite a long time ago, and the person who owned our property many times back had many pieces of property, and it's so hard to delineate when he sold off a piece of property, because he owned a big piece on River Road, I believe, and then he sold off pieces of it. So it's when that our piece, how do you discern between the pieces?
that's where you have to start copying those boundaries down and
Boundary
almost
descriptions,
mapping
yeah.
them out. It's
Okay.
arduous, but that's the only way I know how to really do it.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Yep.
So you copy it down and then you go to another book where he sold another deed or he's.
Yeah,
pieced
you
off
gotta-
his property?
Yeah, yeah. So you have to get, because there'll be a bunch of different names or piece of deeds for that person. So you're gonna have to sort of look at them and start to figure out which one might be the one with the house. And by keeping good track of the boundaries and kind of almost sketching them, it'll help.
So where do you start with you start first with your
Yeah,
boundaries and then you work back?
yep,
Is that how you find? And keep going until you can't, till you hit
Yeah.
a wall.
yep.
Right. And consult those 19th century maps and see if you can match up the verbal description with what the map shows.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's tricky when if you have a new house and you're working on your property, which is what I had when I did my house. And I was eventually able to figure out what the original farmhouse was for my property. But I had a huge piece of paper out and I started making all the boundaries and drawing them in as I was reading the deeds till the pieces of the farm started to come together.
Okay,
Yeah.
because we know this was a dairy farm, but it's
Yeah.
got me really flummoxed. So I kind of stopped.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was probably 25 years ago. So
Well,
Jenny?
maybe we've inspired you to take it up again.
you have, and I've always wanted to go back to it. And I'll just say that we're trying to rebuild this house from the ground up. We have, and as we're going through the house and rebuilding it, we try to leave a little bit of ourselves. I write a note to the next owners of our address and tell them what we've done and why we've done it. So they're going to find, I usually leave coins or little trinkets of some sort that kind of help them envision what our lives were like now. And so hopefully they'll know that we went through COVID, that we tried to fix their house. I mean, we've lived here 38 years, 40 years. So it's been a huge process, but we've left notes for everybody along the way. Hopefully they'll enjoy them 100 to 150 years from now.
Mhm.
That's really great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Jenny.
So I put a bunch of questions in the chat. Do you collaborate? Does Norwich Historic Society collaborate with other town historic societies, both in the interest of history and in research projects? And just wondering, because there was so much travel between towns.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if that's a resource. And then is it useful that much of the main street of Norwich and more is registered in the National Historic Preservation Program? It's probably not called a program, it's probably called something more federal, but and then is a registration process for the state and then federal arduous?
So I can tell you, a few things. We do collaborate with other historical societies, and the families were related across towns, so you're going to find that
Absolutely.
happens, Thetford and Stratford and Norwich, the names are all really similar and the families are. And I find reading the town histories of the different towns really can help to flesh out a family story. The National Register program is run through the federal government, and the state then administers it for Vermont. And it's a big project. And the Norwich Historic Preservation Commission has written a lot of grants to the state because they hire historic preservationists to write the statement of significance, to do all the deed research, to do the architectural analysis, because they kind of have to prove to the the National Register that the house is historically significant. And so there's quite a bit of work that happens with that. And so there are a lot, you know, and the program's been going for decades. So there are many now, but they are a big project. Yeah.
Yeah, so the state takes local responsibility then within the federal program. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Yep.
Because, so, yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Um,
And you can talk to the Norwich Historic Preservation Commission if you want more information about what's happened in our town about it.
Okay.
But the State Historic Preservation Commission is the ones who administer the program.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. Wanda has said that, let's see, Union Village has its own village despite straddling two towns. I heard that the school in Union Village was for students in both towns in the neighborhood. Yeah. And we just put together a walking tour of Union Village, which we offered last year for the first time. And we'll be doing it again this summer. We don't have a date yet, but we definitely talk about how Union Village straddles those two towns. That's why it's called Union, because it was a union of two towns and two counties. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. Alan, thanks. It was really fun to learn the history of your house.
Thank you. Appreciate everybody.
And learn the process you went through to get that.
Yeah.
We're not finished yet.
There's always more, there's always more.
Yeah,
There's always
I really want to trace it back to the beginning. I just haven't had a chance to do it.
So how fluent is the colonization with the Abenaki people in terms of trying to trace different tribes that might have been traveling the lands before the colonizers came?
Well, it was all Abenaki land, and there were Abenaki here when the settlers came, and there were have been Abenaki in town straight through.
Right. And so are you or have you been able to connect your history with their history?
Not specifically this house, no.
Okay. I'm curious about that because I know there are particular digs like in Fairleigh and in other locations. And that could be interesting. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are also just really different approaches to land that one has to
Yes.
think about. So, you know, there's this ownership piece, tracing this ownership piece back. And then you also have a culture that doesn't look at it as ownership. It's in
Right, but
relationship with.
traveling through the summer camp and the winter camp and that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
But when you see that, the reason why I put up a map that shows land from Lake Champlain to the ocean is because there were no boundaries like what we see. You know, their boundaries were the rivers and the water. And so Norwich wasn't a thing. No, this area wasn't a thing that they would have identified as being, you know, this is where we went. So it had much more to do with the confluence of rivers and fishing places and the, you know, beaver ponds and those kinds of things. So it's just so it's almost, to me, it's almost impossible to, you know, trace your property back to any specific, you know what I mean?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. And I think it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge worthy of, but I am not equipped. But I would like to know someone who is equipped.
Yeah.
Thank you for the program.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Right.
I think I'm going to turn off our recording.